All right, so today we are doing our notes on the plague that hit Europe throughout the Middle Ages. So, what was the plague? The plague was a terrible disease that spread throughout much of Europe from 1347 to 1350. And you can actually see in this map how it spread. Those kind of more orangey red islands down at the bottom, that's where it hit in 1347. And then as it moved upward, so 1348 was the orangish color, 1349 is that yellow, and that's how it spread up into Europe. There was no cure known for it, so once you got it, you had it, and very few people would survive. It was highly contagious, but they didn't understand how it was spread. It is estimated that it could have killed 1/4 of all the people at a minimum. It's possible and very likely that it killed more than 1/4 of Europe. It goes by a few other names as well. So throughout these notes, I'll call it the plague. I might also call it the bubonic plague or the Black Death, sometimes the Black Plague as well. It kind of has just been synonymous with all of those over the years. So how did the Black Plague start? It most likely started in Asia. This is stuff that we know now that they didn't understand then. So through doing research and studies, scientists and historians have come up with these ideas and theories. It most likely started in Asia and came to Europe through the Silk Road. If you recall back to 6th grade social studies and a little bit of review this year, the Silk Road was not an actual road, but it was a network of trade routes that connected Europe to Asia for the purpose of trade. And so you could go by boat, you could go walking, riding a horse, a camel, whatever, but it was kind of a pathway, multiple pathways. You were going this direction. So, the Silk Road, more than just ideas and goods came back. Rodents could get into the packaging. Rodents could get into the goods. And one of those common rodents was the black rats, as seen in this picture. And it is believed that the black rats were the ones carrying the bubonic plague, and fleas would also carry them. And, rats are going to be covered in fleas. So if a flea bites this rat and then comes and bites a human, you could now have bubonic plague. They most likely came over on merchant ships with the disease, and that's what we understand it to mean now. But at the time, in the Middle Ages, most people didn't understand where it was coming from, so they thought that the Black Plague was simply a punishment from God, that they had done something to incur his wrath, so he was punishing them. It was bad. As I said earlier, at the very least, it killed 1/4 of the population, but some estimates say 1/3 of the population was killed. In Paris, France alone, they estimated that it killed around 800 people per day. That's a lot, guys. That's a lot by today's standards, but they had fewer people back then. The population wasn't as great, so that was overwhelmingly a lot. Which caused some problems because they can't bury all those bodies. They don't have enough people available to take care of all those dead bodies. So what ended up happening, you would have people go through town with what was called the death cart. And it was essentially a giant wagon. And they would have you dump dead bodies into the cart, or the person would get the dead bodies off the street because people did fall down dead in the street. And they would haul them off to a massive pit that they had dug, off on the outskirts of town, and just throw multiple bodies in one grave at a time. So it was, a way that disease was even spreading more, but it was devastating to see, just to see dead bodies hauled through the street into a massive pit. And remember, these large cities often aren't super clean now, but they really weren't clean back then. You didn't have indoor plumbing, so people would use the restroom in buckets and then just dump them out their window out onto the sidewalk. So you had that in the streets along with dead bodies and trash, and all of that attracts rats. So sometimes entire towns or villages were even wiped out by the plague. What I do want to show you is this graph here of the death tolls, which kind of looks deceiving, so you have to understand what this means, especially on the left side. So if you'll notice on the left side, the y-axis here, the numbers go up in kind of a weird increment for the deaths. It says 0, 500, 1,000, 1,500. It's going up by 500. And then it says break, and then it's all of a sudden 35,000, 36,000, and then break, and then 15 million. The reason they do that is for things like the swine flu, which is that red bar right there. There were, I'm going to guess from this graph, somewhere between 1,700 and 1,800 deaths. So it made sense to go up by 500s when you're charting that. But when you get into things like the normal flu, that's killing 36,000 people a year, if you had been going up by 500 every time, this graph would be huge. And then, I mean, think about the Black Plague, 137 million. I don't even know how tall this graph would be at that point. So they do that break just to show that there's a lot more in that space, but it makes the graph look very misleading. Because even if you just went up by 500s or whatever, that normal flu line would probably be 5 or 6 times taller than it is, making the red spot look much smaller. So it's important to remember that this is kind of a skewed version just looking at it. But again, normal flu, 36,000. Black Plague, 137 million, which is more than the combined death toll of World War I and World War II. Almost double the combined death toll. So what did people do? There was mass panic. If you think about it, the best I can liken it to now that you guys would understand is when COVID first hit in 2020. People didn't understand how you got it. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand how to fix it. And so people went into panic mode and trying to make sure that they were safe and their family was safe. A lot of people in the Middle Ages thought this was the end of the world. So people would lock their doors. They tried to hide in their houses. If a lot of people in one village were dying, they would actually burn down the entire village. And that was in an attempt to kill the disease, as they thought. If we burn down all the houses where the diseased people were living, then that disease can't spread, which is not factual, but they were hoping that's what would happen. So symptoms. I know this picture is a little gross, but it is what it looks like. So the first thing that starts happening is you would get these painful and enlarged lymph nodes that eventually turn black. That's what that kind of swollen area on that guy's armpit is. So your lymph nodes, you have several, but they'd be like in your neck, your armpits, back of your knee. Like there's all sorts of areas, right? And they would get really swollen, they'd turn black, and that's how it got the name the Black Plague. The rest of the symptoms are very similar to average flu. Chills, headache, fever, weakness, stomach pain, sometimes seizures, not just from the disease itself, but more from like high fevers and illness itself, dehydration, all that would start causing seizures. But then ultimately, death. Could you live through the Black Plague? Yes, it was possible, but it was incredibly rare. So, for something so dark, have you ever heard the song Ring Around the Rosie? I'm sure you have. Lots of kids played it. You know, the ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. But did you know that that is written about the Black Plague? So, we're going to break it down line by line. Ring around the rosy actually comes from the rash that people got when they were infected. you would get these marks that kind of look like bruises on your body, but they were bruises almost in the shape of a rose. And then they would get this red circle rash around it. So it was a ring around the rosy mark. This is what you got before you died. Pocket full of posy is, posies are flowers. And remember, there's excrement in the street. There's trash in the street. There's dead and dying bodies in the street. It smells bad. So people would literally carry a pocket full of flowers, or a lot of times they would stuff the flowers into the cuff of their shirt sleeve, so that if they're walking through an area that smells especially bad, they can hold their arm up to their nose and smell the flowers instead. Same idea with having a pocket full of them. They could hold the flowers up to their nose to cover up the smell. Ashes. That's what we were just talking about. They would burn down houses and villages that had people, like if you died in your house, they could leave you in there and just set your house on fire and get rid of it. So whole villages burned down. The sky is dark with smoke and ash. And then we all fall down is, as horrible as it sounds, is exactly that. People just falling down dead, collapsing in the streets and dying. So next time you hear little kids playing Ring Around the Rosie, you'll understand that it was entirely about this horrific time period and disease where at least a fourth of the population died. So the effects of the Black Plague and the consequences today. So it did wipe out a large portion of the population. A lot of these buildings were burned down, and therefore it took about 150 years for Europe to rebuild and to start back on the track. Because while that first map showed that it spread for 3 or 4 years, those were the years that it was most prevalent. 50 years later, people still got bubonic plague. It just wasn't spreading out as much as it was when it first hit. Now we do have a vaccine for it. You can still get it. It is just incredibly rare, and we know how to fix it when you do get it. So most people would recover. Again, I would venture to guess that most of you don't have anything to worry about. But those are your notes on the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages.